Today on The Communicative Leader, we have David Birkam. David is a graphic designer at Western Michigan University, and he works in teaching and learning support. He also recently finished a graduate degree in communication. As a professional creative, David is often tapped for ad hoc or temporary teams, many of which function fully in co-located virtual spaces. David combines his experiences with empirical research he has conducted to give us some communication insights for leaders and members of these virtual ad hoc teams. At the end of the day, he helps us to understand what a typical experience many have, but what an ideal experience can look like for everyone involved. What else? When these teams are led well, output tends to be better, and everyone, members, the leader, the organization, all benefit. Hello and welcome to The Communicative Leader, hosted by me, Dr. Leah O'Million-Hodges. My friends call me Dr. O. I'm a professor of communication and a leadership communication expert. On The Communicative Leader, we're working to make your work life what you want it to be. So, David, before we dive further into your work, can you tell us a bit about yourself, specifically what experiences led you to be interested in this particular area?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So by trade, and I guess by sometimes I feel like it's by chance, I have worked as a graphic designer for the most part, but a general creative for my entire working career, which is both a blessing and a curse in some ways for your influence in communicating with leaders and teams and employers. Yeah, I've been doing creative work for over 10 years now. I often have found that those working as professional creatives in nonprofit, for-profit, corporate, startup configurations that I've been in, creatives, especially those in the communication side of things, kind of end up at the end of the line when it comes to influencing the decisions of communication processes or influencing a product or initiative before it comes to the public part of communication. So that's been an interesting challenge as a professional, and I think a lot of other creative professionals would probably feel the same way. So that's something I've always been interested in, kind of, I don't know, wondering about why that's the case, or wondering like where like a professional creative voice is best used in sort of these like end of the line communications, which relates to kind of the ad hoc teams that I've discussed in research I've done and things I've been interested in. I feel like additionally, working as a creative professional when COVID hit was a really interesting experience. I imagine it was an interesting experience for every single person who works or every single person who's alive. But for me specifically, like I found that with that kind of chaos and uncertainty that pandemic unleashed, and the sorts of like emergencies that came about, the working creative professional suddenly had a bigger voice in certain ways. People were looking to try and do things differently. We're looking to find new solutions or to rethink ways that they had been working in the past. And I think during that kind of crisis, leaders and individually and sort of at organizational levels were looking for more voices. We're more interested in different voices, and I thought that was a really interesting thing that happened, and is kind of itself already changed, and now that the pandemic has moved on to a different stage, and we're kind of more back to business in a lot of ways that I've experienced. And so I was, that's kind of actually been an observation since I've done some of the research that we're talking about today. But regardless, I think that's a really interesting thing I noticed while I was working as a professional, and I brought that curiosity into my research.
Yeah, so interesting. You hit on so many things. This idea of being pulled into all of these initiatives, but
Mm-hmm.
not until the end, because there are people sitting around saying, oh, we need design.
Mm-hmm.
And they don't necessarily know what that means, but then you or one of your colleagues are pulled in. And like you said, a lot of times it's during a chaotic or uncertain situation, or when you're told, yes, we need this, we needed it yesterday. And
Mm-hmm.
you're, hey, great,
Yeah.
lovely, perfect,
Yeah.
perfect way to start the creative process. So, David, so we're going to think about ad hoc teams because we know with the work that you do in particular, you find yourself pulled into all of these different special projects, these different initiatives. Some are short term, some are long term. But when we're
Mm-hmm.
thinking about these special teams, can you tell us how this ad hoc team approach is different than a traditional work group?
Yeah, so the way I've come to define these kind of ad hoc teams, and I focus mostly on ad hoc teams that are working virtually almost exclusively, are those that are typically organized to be temporary. They are workplace culture and even um, just life culture diverse as well as professionally diverse. And they typically get assembled and dissolved as the market and the workplace needs evolve. So, for example, I've worked in an organization where there were, I'll put it in the way of, yeah, there was a recruitment issue, and they assembled a ad hoc team to address this recruitment issue because it was very pressing within a month of certain reporting times that would be very impactful. So that brought in people from my institution in a number of different capacities and a number of different units, and even from completely different vice presidential areas, which is pretty uncommon. So we dealt with people who had, workplace culture, extreme workplace culture differences, people who could not communicate with me in a professional sense. As a professional creative, they wouldn't know Photoshop from any other kind of creative design tool or creative tool, and that team was effective in what it needed to do, but it took a lot of communication, obviously, to make it work in any capacity on a very short timeline.
Yeah, I mean, no pressure, right? Here's an emergency. Now I
Mm-hmm.
need you to work with people you've maybe never even met and using language, kind of this jargon that most people aren't
Mm-hmm.
familiar with. You're the one person at the table with that skill set, and then you're tasked with teaching others about it.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. So you've kind of tapped into my next question. And I know you've been on a number of these virtual ad hoc teams. And like I said, you have this unique skill set. And so a lot of times you are pulled into this. So how does that feel, especially when there are these kind of high stakes, high priority,
Mm-hmm.
challenging assignments?
Yeah, it really depends. Like it's very dependent on, again, like the kind of how like congruent or not like the skills of the individuals are on these teams. Like whether or not there is a meshing there of not only skill and personality, but also personal knowledge, of one another as individuals. It can be very confusing. Obviously, there's usually these teams are started because of particular emergencies within the organization, and often the cause of that emergency or the like kind of solution doesn't exist. The emergency, it's more like we know there's a problem and we're going to assemble a team because we think these people have the skills to address it together. So yeah, often there is no scope of work. Sometimes there is, but it is a very large, it is kind of a target that seems, that's like you really have to question, is this addressable, right? Like that's kind of one of the first questions I've asked in some of these teams is like, is this the configuration of people that can address this problem? And often, to be frank, that you're there to be a band-aid, right? Like, that you're being asked to solve a problem in a very immediate sense, and that hopefully, right, you're going to create some body of knowledge that will also give a long-term answer to your organization. And that can be extremely that can be pretty bad for the morale of the team, right? When you feel like you're a temporary solution to a problem. And so I think leaders that have articulated to me the immediate value of what you're doing and kind of the assurance that we are going to learn from this has been helpful to me. And there's honestly, there's a lot of that, what it feels like to be on that team. There's a lot of that, like, anxiety of like getting to know people, getting to know a leader potentially that you do not know, trying to understand the group dynamic, trying to understand where people are coming from and what their stake is within that team. Some people do not want to be on this team. Some people feel like this team is an opportunity for them to get advancement of some way. Some people could not possibly handle another responsibility. So, as an individual being pushed into these teams, you have to, I feel like there as a member, as someone who is not being given like a formal leadership authority in these teams, you have to be very, you can't help but be defensive when you are put into a team like this. And I think, again, like leaders I've encountered on these teams who work really well, they have a way of like diffusing that defensiveness that I think is really valuable. I mean, some of the folks I've talked to about this work, these sorts of teams, they often speak to these ideas of, there might be a leader, but the team has to figure it out together regardless, because a leader might be just as unfamiliar with the problem of how they're going to solve the problem, like there's definitely a lot of that. And definitely there's the anxiety of the suddenness of it. Like many people I spoke about a random email, or all of a sudden there's a Microsoft Teams call or a Slack call that just happens, or
surprise,
mysterious meetings that pop up in your calendar and things like that. So there's that lay of like not being prompted, or there's no groundwork, which is hard, right? It's an emergency. So like those are sorts of the overriding sense I get is most people feel anxious, right? Some people see an opportunity, but that's not the majority of people I've spoken with. It's often overriding anxiety of like, what does this mean for me personally? What does this mean for, just from a getting along aspect? What does this mean for my job and my responsibilities, and where I am, like, how am I going to fit into this? Like, how much work am I getting? who do I have to deal with, and what does this mean for the rest of the job? I always do normally.
Exactly. I was just kind of smiling to myself when you were talking because all of the leadership and team coaching I've done, I've never thought like sprinkle in some pressure, a whole lot of uncertainty, and then a dash of anxiety. And there you go, voila, we have it. But that's exactly what's happening here. We recognize how much we're putting on individuals. And like you said, a lot of times there's no discussion ahead of time. A lot of people are voluntold that
Yeah.
this is now a priority for them.
Mm-hmm.
So one thing that you kind of touched on, and I know you've done a lot of really neat research on, is this idea of leading an ad hoc team.
Mm-hmm.
So before we get into your lessons learned, can you tell me some of the experiences that you've had with leadership in these
Mm-hmm.
teams? So are people formally appointed? Do we kind of look around the WebEx or the Zoom and see who's going to raise their hand?
Yeah, I mean, the hand raising is typically a secondary consequence. I've almost always been on these teams with a leader of some kind being appointed, and they're usually there to report to another higher up individual within an organization or group. um I that person is nominally in charge, and sometimes is very much in charge, and I've had the privilege of working under some very effective people who have been able to delegate and make people feel important and make people feel like they fit in and that their work is mattering on these teams. And I've also had leaders on these teams who, for better sometimes and sometimes for worse, like really look to the group to help make decisions. Again, it depends on who that person is and what the situation of the work is. Um, I would I've seen like some really great leading delegation where a leader will, be able to identify people's strengths and kind of ask them to take that plunge into leading that part of a team.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, for me, that is always a David, you're going to lead the visuals, or you're going to like the creative side of it,
Yeah,
like whether that's
shocked.
yeah, right, whether that's
Yeah.
messaging, whether that's like
Mhm.
what have you, but I mean, sometimes some of my other skills have been tapped, whether that's
Mhm.
those sorts of skills or that kind of being a professional creative entails, like
Mhm.
project management or just general sorts of problem solving asks,
Mhm.
those sorts of things. But when you have a leader of these ad hoc teams who's able to look out and see people, that can be really great.
Mhm.
And that sort of appointed person is very effective. But I have also been on teams where it is, I mean, it is a squabbling roundtable, but it does work sometimes. I
Mhm.
think there's, and I've learned this lesson from you over time about conflict. And sometimes conflict is what's needed on a
Mhm.
particular team. If you need people to kind of argue out the ideas and argue it out to get motivated, um,
Mhm.
because people always come to these teams with assumptions, right? As I've kind of touched on with culture, like
Mhm.
people come in expecting a culture of conflict, or sometimes they come in expecting a culture of being just ordered around, and that can be very jarring if they don't get what
Mhm.
they're expecting. So I think it also takes a leader, either de facto or not, who can like kind of see the different points of conflict and how are we going to move through those. And yeah, I often that does result in an emergent leader, whether and usually more than one, right? Like you have people kind of vying. Sometimes they're vying for power and sometimes they're helping guide. And I've seen people do that in a really positive way and a really negative way again. And I often see emergent leadership come around subject matter expertise. I am typically one of those people.
Yeah.
So people do look at me for certain kinds of leadership in these settings around my subject matter expertise. And again, that can be really valuable if you have like a marketer or you have a more kind of technical aspect, someone who's, if we're trying to solve a problem with a technical issue, you have to have the technical subject matter expert sort of pushing, right, and leading, or at least guiding the conversation of what's possible and what's not possible if you're running into a technical issue. But that can also be a curse in these kinds of teams, because sometimes subject matter experts steamroll proceedings because they see themselves as the most valuable voice, and they don't have, and no one will check them, or they cannot check them for cultural reasons or organizational reasons. And you end up with someone who only has a part of the picture kind of leading everyone else around, and it can be a problem. It can really end up with some issues occurring. So yeah, leadership is as I imagine you would agree with, it is very complex and multifaceted. And I have always found, no matter, even if it is a kind of deadlock dictatorship, like in theory, like that is how it is supposed to be run, there's always room where things are kind of, there is conflict. And if an appointed leader can't manage that conflict, then they really need to look to their members to see who's emerging to help manage that conflict.
Yeah, that is so, you've done a really nice job of, and certainly we hear all of the challenges that are very real in any group, and especially in ad hoc teams. But I was listening, I was also thinking about some of the opportunities that you pointed out. And what I really like, so you, for example, have this wealth of creative experience, that you're also a phenomenal critical thinker, really great problem solver. You have this impressive ability to take a step back and see the big picture. And I'm not saying this is the case for you, but for some folks, maybe in their traditional work groups, they're not looked to for that because there's someone in a formal position or someone who's already kind of emerged. So there are some opportunities to lean into some other skills. And I also love the kind of endorsement for conflict, right? Because so many people hear it and it's a scary word. But we know when there's conflict, people are invested, right? Which is probably better than being checked out and not feeling like there is something at stake.
Right.
But as you said, if we don't have a leader that can navigate that or is afraid to navigate that, then we're in trouble.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like it would be antithetical to an emergency team dealing with an important issue facing an organization if 90% of the team is just doodling on their their notepads, right? You think, right? If people are being asked, that they would be invested, right? But I think that kind of behavior, if a leader is seeing something like people being totally disengaged or disinvested from the process, like I think that should provoke a little bit of investigation, or some reflection on like, well, we're all here to solve a pressing problem, but nobody is engaged. Then what does that say about the organization? What does that say about this problem? And I mean, also might provoke a little point of self-reflection in a leader as well.
Exactly. And that leads us to my question. So, know that you've done research, you've talked to other individuals who are members of virtual ad hoc teams. And we know that leadership in this assignment can be especially challenging. So, with that in mind, what were some examples of leadership gone awry, or maybe leadership that was absent that either you experienced or your study participants experienced?
Yeah. I mean, as I had mentioned above, like our the SME issue of subject matter expertise, folks who can steamroll a situation that can be a problem. um I've kind of run into this idea that of what I call the deviant and dominant organizational role modeling that leaders can do. And what I mean when I say that is, like, leaders can really lean into how an organizational culture operates, or they can deviate from it, sometimes with success or failure. And it can go awry, especially if you kind of you lean too heavily into both, like, the bad expectations of the organization, or you kind of break, you throw the baby out with the bathwater, kind of thinking, like, uh a lot of my participants reported, that leaders often lean into the organizational culture stuff that gets results, but is extremely exhausting on their team and can create huge down the line problems, right? Like, one of my respondents, who has both been a member and a leader, reported about her organization values deadlines above almost anything. If you will hit your deadline, and if that means you're overworked, if that means that it creates downstream problems, that is not as important as meeting a deadline, which is effective for that organization it seems, up to a point. And other folks talked about how the kind of breaking of accepted norms in the culture is generally acceptable to members if that leader has, like, a high amount of authority, right? If that leader can walk in and say, like, the CEO, the president, the whomever, they have my full support, and I'm doing this to try and get us to a better place, then they're much more willing to get on board. And if they're trying to and breaking with kind of the way of doing things, one of my leader participants spoke to me about how people were really concerned about, like, well, how will all these changes you're enacting affect where I sit? Like, where is my desk going to be? And he had to, because that had been very important. Where you sat signaled power or access, or, like, how much any privileges you had, and he said, I don't care. Like, I don't care where you sit. Like, I care that we're getting this job done. You can sit wherever you want, next to whoever you want. That is not my focus, as a leader in this situation. And again, that you asked about things going awry, that maybe, I think most of us would probably see that as a positive thing, but that can create a downstream problem in leadership, right? Potentially. Like, I didn't get an addendum to that anecdote, so I don't know if that caused any problems in the future, but people are very attached to their culture, even if it's bad culture.
Yep.
And kind of being deviant from that can be very liberating, but it can also throw people completely out of the loop. And the same leader did report another anecdote, that maybe this sitting problem had a part of, I don't know, but he had a kind of a, like, come to the light moment where he was like, look, I need you to do things this way, or you need to not be on this team. And people left. And so he lost, he lost human resources in doing that. He did not, these people weren't punished. These people weren't fired or anything necessarily, but he was like, if you can't do this, I can't have you on this team. And they left. And I would imagine, from the member perspective, that could have been a very awry leadership. But yeah, as far as my own personal experience, like, I've seen leadership go very awry on these sorts of teams when just the person who is on the org chart was put in charge when it shouldn't have been the person on the org chart. It should have been someone with a little bit more humility or a little bit more quick thinking, and things can go very awry when the higher level management or leadership can't think creatively about how these teams are operated. And that I think a lack of creativity on leadership's end is sort of where things always go awry with these teams. Because if you're going to ask people to upend their organizational boundaries, potentially upend their organizational culture to solve a pressing problem, but you do not ask a leader to do that, then that is going to create lots of problems. And, finally, I'll add things, unfortunately, tended to go awry from a lot of my participants, especially my female identifying leaders in gender dynamics. That was a oft cited thing, and things went awry, so to speak, only from probably the perspective of those members who didn't want a female lead on their teams, and the sorts of things those femme leaders had to do to make these teams work. That is another thing that I noted, and also something that a lot of my members were very reluctant to talk about when I spoke with them. So I definitely think there's a lot more work. Well, I know there's much work in the world that's been done about femme leadership in organizations and teams, and I think it's something that has to continually be looked into. I mean, I'm in the position of being, a hetero cis white guy who like comes into this research setting and asks a question about that, and I think me not even getting responses sort of speaks to the power of like how intransigent and difficult gender relationships in leadership positions can be.
Yeah, no doubt. When you were kind of talking about these instances that go awry, I was thinking about the two basic ingredients for leadership, the tasks and the people. And in these ad hoc teams, especially in a virtual setting, tasks oftentimes aren't clearly defined, or maybe someone who doesn't understand the whole scope of the project, or we have our SME who's steamrolling, they're trying to define tasks in a way that's only part. And then the people as well. If we have people who don't want to be there or who are having a really hard time respecting a leader simply because of gender. I mean, we see these as two basic ingredients, and they're hard in traditional work groups, and it becomes a whole new level of complexity when we're thinking in these ad hoc teams, especially under trying situations such as really tight deadlines.
Yeah. No, I mean, yeah, the complexity requires like complex leadership. I mean, I've personally seen leaders try to use the hammer, to break through a complex ad hoc team, and ask like, use threats, use intimidation, to use like ways to, like sort of force an issue. And I don't know, I feel like I could say maybe those teams did a job, but was it a job it was asked to do? Almost never. It's typically, again, like only reinforces negative sentiment, and it makes the next job that much harder. And of course, that leads to a lot of other complex downstream problems in an organization.
100%. You bring that bad experience. Oh, gosh. And it's astounding to me, again, a leadership communication expert, that folks still think pressuring and hard tactics and demanding this is it. This is the way. It just,
Yeah.
But that leads me to one thing that I really love that you uncovered in your work was the importance of trust. And we can recognize that sometimes the situation, the context, it's just not going to be ripe for trust, considering
Right.
how someone is communicating and modeling expected behaviors.
Mhm.
But what can you tell us about what you found in terms of trust in these virtual and ad hoc teams?
Yeah, I mean, I felt like I learned a lot from the member participants I spoke to in this situation. I think the leader participants I all spoke to had great um sentiments on this, and they all said trust was critical. They all said that that's how they want to do things. I remember one of my leader participants said something around like, well, what's the fun of a dictatorship? Like he articulated that as like, like dictatorship is the absence of creativity and trust. And I think those were all wonderful sentiments. I think they were valuable. I did feel like a lot of the members had more of the bullet points of like what
Mhm.
they wanted to hear from someone. And I think a lot of that boiled down to just like interpersonal recognition that of their humanity, like,
Yeah.
will they be willing to learn my name and address me as such? Like, will they like tell the I love this from one of my participants. They had said like, I would really like the leader to articulate why I'm valuable to this team.
Mhm.
Because I think a lot of the times we end up in these teams and you do it a round table, we all introduce ourselves, and we all are maybe kind of vying and saying like, I'm here, I think, because or like I
Mhm.
think, there no one is maybe saying I think, but you can tell like in the tone of their voice of like, I'm really
Mhm.
good at this thing. Is that
Yeah.
why I'm here? Like, where I feel a leader who can articulate that or be like, David is here because this is
Mhm.
going to be a heavy social media push, and we're going to need a lot of social media graphic design assets
Mhm.
created. Um, David is here because we need to make sure that we are very on brand with our visuals, and he also understands what
Mhm.
that means for our tone as well when we're communicating with our audience. You know, you know, a lot of my participants said they really valued that. They valued like
Mhm.
a leader initially being able to describe why they are here, and what they are expected to be bringing. And then in addition, kind of following along with that thread, several of my participants, I would kind of summarize this of several things participants said into kind of trust is earned by the team from a leader, or the team trusts each other more when someone, hopefully that's the leader, typically can articulate, the known and unknown information about the problem and the task, can create meaningful delegation out to the team of like
Mhm.
what people should need to be doing individually, and then how that feeds into the larger group. And as I had said already, acknowledging the humanity and the expertise that each person is bringing. And I think very importantly for a lot of people, they acknowledge they get more trust out of a group when they can know what the meaningful end work goal or the team's scope is, and they
Mhm.
really would prefer if there was a calendar attached to that as well. Like, people want to know how long they're going to be invested into a problem. And I think sometimes the intuitive sort of function, I think of the kind of commanding leadership would be, well, if I give people an end date, then they know when they can check out, and I'm not going to get everything I can from them, or they're going to cram and then wait until the last minute to do what I need them to do because that's the date. And I think, for most people, like I said, like, a lot of people are very engaged if they're brought onto these teams.
Mhm.
They're scared, they're anxious, but they do want to help, right? And if you can give them a meaningful scope of work, or what an end state looks like, what an afterlife could look like for this team, and a
Mhm.
date at which the meaningful work is accomplished, like that goes a long way to give people the ability to compartmentalize and think about how much can I devote to this? Where is my head at the where are the chunks, right?
Yeah. Yep.
I've heard people on your podcast say before, use the aphorisms of eat the elephant one bite at a time kind of
Yes.
thing.
Yep.
And I think people need that, right? Because if they're staring down a huge problem, they don't know when this will end. And as I said, like, these are ad hoc emergency teams. One would think intuitively, right? That means like there's an end date. And often there is not. Like there's like, this is a problem. When will the problem, when are we going to try to solve the problem by? When it's solved, And so that creates a huge amount of stress on members and mistrust of like, how long am I roped in for this? Like what does this mean for my regular what does this mean for my regular duties? Like that's those are the things that always come up. So yeah, like humanity, dates, times, like, and also again, what do they know, what do they not know? Like again, I mentioned that briefly, but like being able to articulate like what we know about the problem and what we don't know about the problem is so important, because that can give the team, that scopes the team's work in many different ways.
Yeah. And what I really enjoy about this response, and I think it shows the importance of your research and the impact of your research, is that it's really simple, right? It's not very simple, but there's a simple way to get started. This is why you're here. This is what we're going to look to you for. And then some basic scaffolding, right? This is, like you said, this is what we know, but let's also define what we don't know, what we're not aware of, what we need to find out. And with that scaffolding, if we're just building in next steps, some potential future dates, a potential future place, recognizing, this might move, this might be tentative, but this is what we're working with now. Really, really simple things, but things that would set up teams and employees to generally have much better experiences when they're pulled in here. I think too, in another way, it's an honor to be pulled in, to say, we have this problem at the organizational level. You have this really specialized skill set and we need you. So I think if these were done better, it'd be a way for employees to feel good and extra validation for what they're doing. But the way they're often done, it kind of feels like a punishment, I imagine, at times.
Yeah. And I will say, some of my participants did talk about teams where the problem was so immediate and so pressing and was very hands-on, to the point where they were there to be a body, like they were there to be to backfill a capacity that didn't exist in the organization. And I think after that trauma, or during that trauma perhaps, like an organization needs to recognize how much people are stretching themselves to fill in, for that, or that needs to be considered right down the line, again. And that's why I, in my research and some of the things I've looked at, it's like teams need to have ways to document themselves and what they did, and especially towards like sorts of the deep like expansion of capacity or ability that is happening when sometimes you are pulling people in as a body to do a thing that they might not know anything about. And I think like, right, that's hard, right? But I just made that recommendation of like, why are you here, right? And the leader doesn't really want to stand there and say you're a body, but some I've been there, some people have said that, but like I think like if you're gonna do that to people, you need to have a way to reward them, and I write, lots of organizations, they cannot provide financial compensation, or they won't. But having a way that someone's going to get recognition or going to get a benefit out of doing that that doing something completely different or
Mm-hmm.
new, like that's important. That needs to be considered.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And that makes me think of another element of your research when you talk about the importance of co leading. So, can you talk to us about what you mean by co leading and what that might look like in an ad hoc team?
Yeah, so I pulled co-leading out of a lot of the academic literature I was looking at for this research, and the ways that many different researchers over time have looked towards um, unorthodox ways of teams or organizations organizing themselves to accomplish a task or to exist. And co-leading is, I think, in my context of the ad hoc team, that does typically exist with a nominally appointed formal leader. Like, co-leading is a way in which the formally appointed leader is intentionally, and often sometimes intentionally, shedding some of those work responsibilities or leading tasks to members of the team. And they do this in order to, give themselves more capacity. And I mean, as I've said before, like, often this happens because these teams are dealing with problems of such complexity and working with members of such diverse skill sets that one individual doesn't have the capacity to lead all of these people in this specific kind of way. So yeah, co-leading is sort of like, especially in this context, it's sort of an agreed upon division of leadership, that is either agreed upon because it just happens and everyone accepts it, or through, again, as I've kind of indicated, like, very thoughtful delegation of leadership.
Mm-hmm.
And co-leading takes the form of, I think people don't often give enough credit. Like, people are like, oh, a leader who's listens so well,
Mm-hmm.
like, sometimes leaders are co-leading when they're listening very well, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
they're making decisions with a group, like, the group is we enshrine the concept of the single leader so much in our
Mm-hmm.
culture.
Mm-hmm.
We don't give enough credit to, like, when someone's willing to let go of, like, all power. And I think even, like, when you're talking about a leader who's thoughtful enough to listen to a team,
Mm-hmm.
be able to, like, be an arbiter of the different things this team wants to do, and maybe the final decision lies with them, but often they will delegate the decision power out to, again, subject matter expertise,
Mm-hmm.
or to members who have really stepped up and be like, I've been in
Mm-hmm.
a situation where, like, a leader will be like, oh, so and so, you uh, you know, person A, B, and C are going to report to you in this for this type of work or this part of the problem we're addressing, and then you're going to report out to everybody else, and you're going to have. I want you to be making decisions about, like, how your team works, or, like, or your micro team inside of the team, how
Mm-hmm.
you work, or how you're going to capture your work or whatever, and those sorts of, like, meaningful leadership delegation parts, where, like,
Mm-hmm.
kind of the nominal head leader is sort of shedding some of that responsibility. But also, I've seen co-leading. I would also use co-leading in this context to kind of, again, capture that concept of emergent leadership. And
Mm-hmm.
sometimes some of the participants I talked to, there was the nominal leader had no capacity to lead. They were there basically to be like, I'm here to take a report to, like, my person,
Mm-hmm.
me, and yeah, get that work done, guys. And
Mm-hmm.
so members often spoke of, like, an ad hoc within the ad hoc
Mm-hmm.
of leadership, and how, like, they're like, I guess we're figuring this out ourselves. And
Mhm.
so people would kind of band together under several individuals who would all kind of they'd intuitively break the task out and figure it out for themselves. And they co-led together in the absence of a strong formal leader. And so that's kind of, and that can be, and we would think like intuitively, I'm saying intuitively
Mhm.
a lot, but I feel like, I think that is, I think, how a lot of us operate when it comes to leadership.
Mhm.
Like there are a million ways people have been taught to lead, and a lot of it
Mhm.
is basically through hard lessons. And we would tend to think, right, that if people came together and led themselves, um, they would be very excited about that and they would feel good about it.
Mhm.
And look at what we did. We did this together. But because of
Yeah.
how organizations are created, organizations operate, and the kinds of cultures we all live in with,
Mhm.
singular leadership, people tend to see their co-leading in the absence of a strong leader as another burden on them.
Mhm.
And it can feel just as
Mhm.
much as a punishment for them
Mhm.
to have
Yep.
to have done that. So yeah, co-leading, again, I kind of see it in two ways. I see it as, in the configurations I've witnessed in this research and the things I've looked at, a thoughtful leader who's thoughtfully delegating, still kind of,
Mhm.
wants to be there, wants to be leading this group, but is recognizing the limitations of their own individual ability, or
Mhm.
capacity, or people kind of scrambling to lead themselves in the absence of a strong leader.
Mhm.
Obviously, the research I looked into also pointed to a lot of examples of, non-traditional, non-hierarchical leadership. That
Mhm.
could be anything from a food co-op to a workers owned business, to
Mhm.
collectives and things like this. But in my kind of point of view, looking at kind of very traditional organizations in this research, yeah, the co-leading from the emergent point,
Mhm.
it's more of a matter of survival and a matter of kind of working around an ineffective leader.
Mhm. Yeah, it's really a helpful way of thinking about, especially when you're going into it and recognizing that this is likely to be participative and these tasks are going to be distributed. And I might have a leader who really is savvy with this and really thoughtful with our time and the scope of work. And I might have a leader who is not.
Mm-hmm.
And you touch on a really important point about our culture in particular, where a leader is a hero or a scapegoat, and
Mm.
really nothing in between, right? And this idea of co-leading can help us to step away from that. And you've talked about had a follow-up question on the importance of, co-leading or establishing co-leadership in a distributed or participative leadership. And you've talked about leader capacity,
Mm-hmm.
talked about just kind of needing to fill in the gaps. Is there anything else you would say in terms of, arguing for the importance of co-leadership in these unique groups?
Yeah, my research into some of the existent literature pointed to a few um, a few authors kind of advocated for distributing leadership for
Mhm.
a number of reasons. One, of course, as I've already mentioned, is a capacity reason.
Mhm.
Um, Others have advocated that it develops a sense of shared belief in the
Mhm.
mission of the team, and can help create an emergent culture for that team.
Mhm.
Which I would say I witnessed in some of my participants talking about the ways that they, by kind of co-leading with each other, were able to create an emergent mini culture for their specific
Mhm.
team, and how that actually had knock-on positive effects down the line, right? Because once they had done this, they had kind of grown their own capacity for
Mhm.
leadership personally, and had importantly created really strong connections with these other
Yeah.
people that had helped kind of lead through a team. They were able to walk away and in the future have these amazing resources they could pull on of different individuals they had been a part of,
Mm-hmm.
and then also skills that they had acquired themselves. So, creating, like, allowing people to kind of lead and co-lead these teams, that you're building capacity for your organization, right? That's like your future leaders
Mm-hmm.
potentially within the organization, that um, kind of being forged in the fires, so to speak.
Yep.
Obviously, he wouldn't want necessarily have that occur because of poor organizational poor organizational
Mm-hmm.
practices. But I mean, like, seeing that and recognizing that as an organization is something an organization can take out of that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and other authors had, and this was again sort of echoed by some of my participants, was that kind of distributing leadership really ups the level of responsibility that people take for their
Mm-hmm.
own work. Like, if I am co-chair, de facto, yada yada, and I'm responsible for the quality of a
Mm-hmm.
smaller number of people's work, or I helped craft the decision that is going to be made out of this team on policy, that's on you. I'll point to a personal anecdote. I've been on teams, graphic design, ad hoc teams, but specifically in the creative sense, where I was working with a lot of like-minded, adjacent skill set individuals, and we were working on a problem, but it was not really a co-leading situation, and I know the decision we came to at the end was contentious with our audience, and I directly had people say to me, well, I wasn't in charge, my name's not on this, I don't care, and like, just another
Cool,
day
cool.
kind of
Yeah.
thing. So, like, that can be a knock on
Mm-hmm.
it. Like, you're not, like, if you're not allowing people kind of to be part of that decision making process, then you're
Mm-hmm.
clearly not invested. So yeah, those were definitely some other things
Mm-hmm.
that seemed to come out of my research that felt
Yeah.
important around, like, what are the benefits of using a distributed leading or co-leading.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, buy-in and identity. I mean, those are huge.
Mm-hmm.
And you talk about the importance of what that can generate in terms of outcome.
Mm-hmm.
And that leads me to a question, and this is something I really enjoyed from your research, and something I honestly hadn't necessarily thought about before you dove into this line of inquiry, was the idea of knowledge generation and knowledge sharing as an outcome of being on an ad hoc team or a
Mm-hmm.
virtual ad hoc team. And this is a huge, huge benefit. So, can you talk to us about this?
Yeah, absolutely. So I feel like my kind of like the hot take, I guess it's not so hot. I did a bunch of research, right? Is that even a hot take if you've done research? But
It's always a hot take when it comes to
right,
research.
right.
Yeah.
So uh, the takeaway I came from this is, like, an ad hoc team solving a potentially existential problem for an organization, or even
Mhm.
a culture problem, a procedure problem, whatever that
Mhm.
team is doing, is as valuable in solving the problem as it is generating new knowledge for the organization. And often what that means is, like, generating, like, procedures, generating project management skills, generating networks and relationships,
Mhm.
generating new forms of work practice that an organization could pay a consultant to teach them, but they
Mhm.
learned on their own through their own people, right? Like, even the knowledge of how to operate a team like this is valuable to an organization, because it's highly likely that organization is going to need another emergency ad hoc team in the future, right? So, like, the value of how a team can create useful documentation or useful ways of
Mhm.
sharing its knowledge, and whether that could come in a number of different ways. Often, I think what people generally associate with a team at the end of the day is they maybe write a report and some recommendations. And then many of the member folks I talked to, of course, lamented that, well, that went on a shelf and I never saw it again. And I have no idea what that was, but I think the research I looked into, the literature spoke about, interesting ways that this could be done differently, right? Like a team sharing its knowledge through a live event, at the end of a project, a team creating, doing explicitly being authors within, a content management system that an organization uses, whether that's like starting a thread inside of a team, Microsoft Teams, like writing, a document, like having a conversation in that way, creating articles within a help desk, that kind of thing, or, like being tapped to kind of like take these lessons and package them into learning management, creating an ad hoc team training module or what have you, afterwards, like kind of using like more rich media as opposed to PDF to like report out what you've done. And I think the value of this sort of cross-discipline, ad hoc, emergency, all these superlatives I've added onto these sorts of teams, like, right, they teach an organization about its wider self because it's a microcosm of the organization, right? If you have people from different departments and different areas and different expertise all interacting with each other, you get to see like all those different cultures, all those different microcultures of different teams or units, like combining or crashing into each other, and documenting that or figuring out how to do that is a really useful thing for an organization. I think one of my favorite examples from the literature was journaling, just straight up like having team members journal their experiences and being able to have that like individual perspective that isn't full of like, jargon and workies and like it's not about the KPIs or all those good acronyms we have in the world, but like people really expressing their experience and making that available to people, or having those journals be available to other team members, right, as like the process goes on. This could, because then you are seeing each other, you're seeing each other's struggles, you're seeing like how you're all affecting each other. That, of course, right, that's asking a lot of vulnerability from people, which a lot of people really commit to in a workplace, but it's a potential start, or the same authors describe the ways in which the like people would kind of do end of day write-ups to kind of their immediate team members, where that way like kind of knowledge is being shared, perspectives are being shared, and it isn't necessarily, that version of it isn't a journal, it's more a write-up thing, but it goes directly to each other, as opposed to, I think a lot of us have used project management suites where you enter something into an interface and it leaves a comment, and then who is going to read that, kind of thing. But if it's structured more as it's a direct communication between each other, like people are more likely to read that. So, but yeah, knowledge generation and knowledge sharing, like there's several ways to approach it. There's more complex ways that I've described here. There's ways of like building databases, I'm sure, as technology advances and we have more intelligent digital coworkers, I guess, in the future, kind of working with us. Maybe those are the kinds of entities that can grab that knowledge and get more useful things pulled out of it. We already see how social media does these sorts of things with algorithms and stuff like that, keywords and sentiment and things like that. But yeah, like, I mean, having your people document their work, and then be able to encourage them and build into the process ways in which not just documentation, but then deliverable, and create things that benefit the organization, or reward those people by making them, the folks who teach people how to do certain things, or give them a change in their position to where they're more engaged with their colleagues through spreading what they've learned through a process, like that can really benefit an organization I think it benefits an organization in well-being. It benefits an organization in just growing your own kind of knowledge base, which so many organizations spend so much time buying expertise and buying knowledge that comes in and does its thing, and then it goes away. And but if it's homegrown, I feel like you have a higher chance of success in that way.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with everything. All of the above. When I was listening to you and thinking about knowledge generation, I was just thinking of how expansive it is. Because I think before, I personally would think, oh, the deliverable that this team did, or this problem, this tangible solution to this pressing issue. But you talk about, the idea of honing your own project management skills, or maybe being able to teach these different stages of working through an ad hoc team and creating community. Even the clout that one can earn as part of working through this and sharing those experiences. So knowledge in a really broad sense, in a way that would fit and could fit any employee in the way they want to lean into. So yeah, thank you for that. That's really a helpful thing to be thinking about.
Yeah.
So David, I have two final questions for you. So, as you know, on the Communicative Leader, we like to leave listeners with communication or leadership communication tips. And I like these to be really pragmatic. So, something they can do now to start making the work life what they want it to be. So, with that in mind, what advice do you have for organizational members who find themselves, they're tapped, they're voluntold, or they volunteer themselves for an ad hoc team? How did they make the most out of that experience?
There were a few things that I thought of for this question. The first being, make connections with people you're being thrown into with. Look for the people that seem congruent to who you are. At the very least, you never know who you're going to end up working with. You never know what kind of valuable relationship you could have down the line with that person. And at the very least, right, if you go through this experience with someone that could be very stressful or very, very unpleasant, potentially, and you come out the other end liking that person, that's someone you would maybe want around at your workplace, and someone you could at least reach out to when times are hard, or someone you can just that you get along with and you jive with. Make those connections. Not only through kind of the traditional networking and power, gaining influence, all that good stuff, but it's so important to have people you like at a job. I don't think a lot of us even consider that when we're considering a workplace, or how we're going to end up. But if you come into a team and you find people you enjoy spending time with in a difficult situation, they can be very important for you down the line. And kind of the two kind of interrelated things are both about boundaries, right? We're so trained, obviously, to say yes, do. But if you're being pulled into an emergency, you need to figure out how this emergency ad hoc team you're being asked to participate in affects your work duties, your common work duties. And you need to get that squared with your traditional reporting mechanisms of whoever you will report to, whether that's a manager, a committee, whatever. And whoever is kind of leading or has overall authority of this team you're being asked to participate in, like, and you need to get that as soon as you can. Like, are you being moved full time onto this emergency? Okay, then then you need to set up and have that expectation of asking people, what do I tell my people who need me? What do I tell my customers, or what do I tell my constituents in my position that I can't do the thing they are expecting me to do now? What's the messaging? Or, like, if it's a half and half, like, what am I giving up? What am I keeping? What is critical? What is not? And do I have a say in that? And you need to figure that out as quickly as possible, within within a short amount of time as you can manage. And speaking up for that is difficult. And, sometimes you don't want that to be the thing you're hashing out in the first meeting of a team that's trying to handle a pressing problem of, like, well, because that can rob a team of a lot of momentum and time. I would say it's still, I think the imperative is to protect your ability and your well-being and you're doing with your own work. But thinking creatively around, like, is this an email, that goes out and you're assigned to a team? Is this the cross-channel, like, touching base with somebody through instant messaging? Is this a phone call? Do you need to talk to someone in person? Getting those ground rules established as soon as you can, and try not to wait, like, for when a team convenes to do its work. Try to get that figured out with your manager individually, or in a co-leading, like, figure that out with the people you're on this team with. Like, I couldn't guarantee possibly that one would not face repercussions for trying to have those conversations with other employees of an organization by themselves. But trying to have that conversation as quickly as possible of, like, where are the boundaries of this? Like, yeah, I kind of have 2 points on my notes that are really more of that, just that one thing. But yeah, like, and also, like, come prepared with your knowledge around project management and team management. I've found often I have been put into a team and I might be the only person who has ever done project management, like, or tried to, or has been on it, practices it. Like, and that's a big ask sometimes, to try to inoculate a large C team into something like that. But having that discussion with your team, again, this new team, as quickly as possible, of, like, how are we managing our tasks? How are people reporting? Like, if people refuse to use a project management suite or something like that, and they only want to use email or something like that, really, like, get that structured as quickly as possible. Because, and, really, like, try to use your influence on your nominal leadership or your own, like, kind of leaderful behaviors to really, like, figure out the ways in which you're going to manage this project. I think those are really critical. Make connections, make boundaries, make the structure for how you're going to work.
Yeah, just setting the groundwork early. So helpful. And recognizing that when we do that work early, it's going to pay off throughout the process and then afterwards as well. So my last question, a follow-up to that. So we've talked about these employees who are tapped to be members. What about our organizational members who are then appointed to lead an ad hoc team or virtual ad hoc team? What advice do you have so we set those friends up to be successful?
Yeah, I would say, from the participants I spoke to, there's so much you can get done with humility and recognizing the kind of the cause and effects of this situation on the members that are being asked to participate. Just being human, just recognize this is hard and it can be a challenge, is a huge, huge thing. I think, a lot of people probably imagine that they're going to go into this situation, they're going to give that rousing speech, and people are just going to respond to it. But I think from what I've observed, the people who are successful are the ones who are able to articulate like the problem, recognize the humanity of the people you're working with and how they are interacting with that problem, and being able to recognize where these people are going to help you, where are they going to help you all get to where you need to be. Because the most important thing is accomplishing the task, solving the problem, getting past the crisis, whatever it is, like doing that and learning from it is just going to, hopefully that makes this, wherever you are, a better place to be. And I think, personally, I feel like, leaders are most successful when they are making the lives of their team members easier to interact with the problem they're facing, which I feel like in the long run makes the leader's task easier, or the leader's problem easier. It's communicating it. Like, again, you need to tell people what you know and what you don't know, and how you're going to figure out what you don't know, or how they're going to figure out what you don't know together. Like, it's just it's like, again, every single leader I spoke to, it was like as much transparency as they can muster. And transparency means different things to different people, but but that like guide stone of like transparency, and transparency is also seeing each other as human beings, and like that, and recognizing that like we're not just a role, and we're not just a subject matter expertise, but we're also people who are trying, who move on the good faith notion that people want to solve this problem with you.
Yes. Yep. Exactly. Well, thank you, David. That's so helpful. And I think that we're going to continue to see more virtual ad hoc teams with the way in which workplaces are shifting and evolving. And for better or for worse, we know that these crises and these unexpected scenarios aren't going anywhere. And so your advice is going to be really helpful for so many. So thank you for your time and your expertise.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity, Dr. O. This has been a wonderful time.
All right, my friends, that wraps up our conversation today. Until next time, communicate with intention and lead with purpose. I'm looking forward to chatting with you again soon on The Communicative Leader.